All right, it is May the 9th, 2025. It is just Deanna and I today to speak on several IRCC developments. We will be walking through a PDF that I obtained through an Access to Information Act request from IRCC that is from a unit at IRCC that reports issues that employers are having to other units within IRCC. And so I obtained through an Access to Information Act about 150 of these complaints. We've chosen about 5 to 10 to just talk about, as well as other topics, and it gives a pretty good overview of different issues at IRCC that I guess the new government might want to discuss. Right off the bat, we have a question that is also being raised a lot these days by Christopher on YouTube. And the question is, General Canadian Experience class draws, comprehensive score 498. Is there any hope so far in 2025? So for those who don't know, Express Entry, Canada's largest economic immigration program, everyone is ranked against each other. They get a CRS score, comprehensive ranking score, based on factors such as age, education, employment, language, whether they have a spouse in Canada, no longer arranged employment. And the question is whether 498 points will be enough. Deanna, I don't know if you have thoughts on this.
I have thoughts on this, and I don't see that 498 is going to be a pass score in 2025. That's just my personal perspective on it. I feel like it comes from sort of conversations we've been having about what's going to happen to that big cohort of temporary residents who are here in Canada, and just the kind of aura of the year, which is people really trying to find every means possible to extend their stay and to try and ride things out, hoping to learn French, hoping to do all sorts of things like that, in order to see if there's a way to sweeten their score. So the competition is going to remain strong, I think. What do you think?
How many minutes have we been at it? 2 minutes and 54 seconds. I think it will depend on whether they stick to their Francophone targets.
For sure.
Right now, so the interesting thing about Express Entry, when the points first started, 450 to and below used to be the range. Like I think
it's a really good score.
The pandemic, it went as low as 415. If you used to have 450 points, that was considered a high score.
Yeah.
Then then the points increased during COVID to about 470 and have since gone up and up. People have talked before that we always bring up the Francophone immigration program. This is one of the reasons, is because Express Entry is a zero-sum game. There are so many people who can get invited each time. And because there are so many draws exclusively for Francophones, that because the Francophone draws are so predominant, it means that the amount of draws for non-Francophones is limited, and that is why the points are so high. So if they stick to their Francophone draws, then I think that it's going to be difficult for non-Francophones in Express Entry. If they get rid or reduce the targets, then it will be easier. Mark Carney, the Prime Minister, in the 2025 election platform said that they were going to maintain and increase Francophone draws to 12% instead of the current 10%. And again, people look at those numbers and think it's not a lot, right? 10%, 12%, but it almost all comes from Express Entry. So if you think like Express Entry is, 20 to 30% of Canada's immigration, then 10 to 12% of that is just eating more and more of the spots.
Yeah, and if you just look over the last few months of express entry draws, like you'll see the last time they did like a straight up CEC draw was in February 2025, and the pass mark there was 421. Sorry, 521. And that was only 4,000 invitations. That was 4,000 invitations at 521. But the French draws, those are showing up, and they're coming, every couple of weeks in the last little while. And those are inviting 6,500, 7,500, and with scores as low as 379. So, if you're just doing a comparative, there are these tiny draws for other discrete programs like, the provincial nominees. They'll do 800 here, 800 invitations issued, 400 invitations, 500 invitations, but then 7,500 all in one go with French language proficiency. So they're just eating up, even with health service, healthcare and social services occupations, they only invited 500, and even those had to have a 510. And the education occupations, they did 1,000, but they had a 479. So again, it's just the competition between the non-French streams and the occupation-specific streams and the general CEC open door. It's just too tight.
So it just becomes a question, will the Liberals keep their promise? I happen to think not. I think, as I discussed 1 or 2 podcast episodes ago, that they will increase immigration, but you wouldn't want to bet your immigration strategy on that prediction, because while I think that it's hard to advise people, like, don't worry, the Liberals won't stick to their election platform.
But I think a lot of people were wondering how the removal of the ranged employment points was going to affect things. Like, was that going to drop the score at all? And it didn't have the big effect. It just made people feel like they had less control over ways to actually improve their score. But I don't think it changed the degree of competition or even, what the pass mark has been at. So that, I think, was quite discouraging. And I think really, unless a whole lot of people leave the pool, it's going to be, I think the competition is going to be similar. I understand what you're saying about increasing the percentage of the number of the immigration numbers in general. But I really agree with what you said, Steve. Since you said it a couple of episodes ago, it really changed my way of thinking, that there's something, the French draw it's a cover up for something different. Like, they're using it in order to accomplish some other goal than the one that's stated. And I think what you had inferred was that it ends up being sort of country specific draws without having to be country specific draws. And so, I think that's really part of the challenge.
Yeah. And just to present a counterpoint, a listener reached out to me to say that immigration lawyers who talk about the Francophone program seem to be forgetting that in the 2021 election, the government, the Liberals, committed to Francophone migration as part of their election platform. And I've just pulled up the page for those who want to go read it. It's page 33 of the 2021 Liberal platform, which was that in order to protect and promote our official languages and linguistic duality, Canada will counter the lost demographic weight of Francophones in Canada through an ambitious national strategy to support Francophone immigration outside of Quebec, end quote. So, I mean, it's fair. They've been talking about, it was in the 2021 platform. Sure. The official rationale, it's interesting too, because the official rationale in the election platform was that the goal of the Francophone program was to counter the lost demographic weight of Francophones. In the immigration system, they have tried to squish it into economic immigration. And people have often said, like, why is this an economic immigration program? And this seems to lend credibility that, like, at least in 2021, it wasn't talked about as an economic thing. It was just, we've lost the demographic weight of Francophones, so now we're trying to increase it.
I think that, and this is something that I've raised repeatedly, I find it to be an overstretch to call this a francophone program. French language proficiency is what it's actually about, but I think that it's a long way from actually doing something to build French language communities, because I think that, as we see, when it's people sort of desperately looking to get that TEF score that will give them the minimum number of points that will enable them to be qualified for this draw, people with no intent or attachment, no job requirement that they be working in the French language, I really wonder whether or not it achieves that goal at all. If it were achieving that goal, I would have far less issue with it. But I think really, if they were going for actual francophones, where there would be French language communities that were built, then I think that they would have a lot less pushback than what they're having right now. But I don't really think that that's what's being done. I think that they've put it through the algorithm, and it's caused a warping of what the skilled worker selection is about.
Yeah. I don't know. I do 2 lessons of French a day on Duolingo, about 6 minutes, and according to ChatGPT, in about a decade, I'll be there. At least to what immigration calls francophone.
Yeah.
Going into our mini updates. So the first one from this PDF talks about, and again, this was from 2023. So practitioners now will look at this and say, that sounds like a good processing time. But the complaint from employers was that the current processing time for work permit extension applications is 158 days. The unit at IRCC has received various feedback here that people are using it to get maintained status. And so people are submitting work permit applications that I guess they're not qualified for because it's taking 158 days, which is an abuse of the system. And so there's 2 things to take away from here. First, and I think what I mainly want to talk about, and then we can do both the dummy applications issue, but first, right now it is taking, here we pull it up, 233 days for IRCC to process inside Canada work permit extension applications. At Larley Rosenberg, the firm where I work at, we have a Slack, and each day someone will post the current processing time and be like, this is the longest processing times have been. And then there's that Simpsons meme where Bart tells Homer, this is the longest or whatever it's ever been. And Homer goes, the longest so far. And then each day we're able to do that meme again and again because the processing times keep going up, which is crazy, right? Like it's 233 days to
the better part of the year.
Yeah. During that time, if your work permit is expired, you cannot, for most types of work permits, if you leave Canada, you cannot re-enter and continue working. So employees are, a lot of them, essentially trapped in Canada, unable to visit family, unable to go on business trips, while IRCC slowly processes their work permit.
I don't know this, Steve. Is there still that? Because I remember there was that interim authorization where when you were waiting to change from one employer to another, you could start in the new job. Is that still in place?
Yeah, they still have that. And it's also not, it's not only in the new employer, it's a new job, it's a new employer or a new job.
Right.
So from what I understand, some people are trying to use the interim work authorizations to try to continue working if they exit Canada and re-enter. I wouldn't take that for anyone listening as legal advice. In fact, don't anyone listening. We probably should do a better job of disclaiming this, but like, don't take what you read or hear here or see here as legal advice. But from what I understand, the interim authorization letters can be used to sort of get around that restriction on maintained status. What are your thoughts on what IRCC is talking about, though? Dummy applications, people who apply for work permits that they aren't eligible for in order to get, and now 233 days to work.
Mm-hmm. I don't like the practice of dummy applications. I don't. And I think that I take a pretty hard stance on not filing an application that I know is just a bogus throwaway application. At the same time, I think that I have very little sympathy for the department on these processing times. And I feel like, they do oftentimes leave people between a rock and a hard place. What they're calling dummy applications, I think, is to me a little bit, it's a question for conversation, because sometimes people will be, let's say, waiting for an LMIA to be approved, or waiting for an acknowledgement of receipt on their permanent residence application, and that once that acknowledgement of receipt arrives, they'd be entitled to an open bridging. So it's like one processing time is competing against another. So and just to spell that out a little bit more, if you've applied, let's say, for permanent residence in a spousal category, you can't apply for your work permit until you have an acknowledgement of receipt. And if that acknowledgement of receipt doesn't arrive, do you file the work permit extension so that you don't lose status if your own permit expires in the meantime? Is that a dummy application? Because you're waiting for immigration to give something to you that you would then give back to them. So it's
or if you're waiting for an LMIA.
Yeah, exactly. The LMIA is a perfect example. It's like one government department is not speaking to another in the same federal government bureaucracy, and that then they're calling it a dummy application strictly because you're waiting on two different departments on different timelines. And so I think that can be overly broad, the way that they're calling something a dummy application.
Yeah, and then even like a lot can change in 233 days. So from what are you going to tell an individual that in 233 days their employer may get an LMIA, they may switch jobs, and so apply for something and say you're working with an employer to get an LMIA, which could happen, or do you just give up? I think it is a very I'm not critical of anyone who submits work permit applications to buy time, given that so much can happen. Obviously, you can't misrep in the application.
Yeah, or just when I'm talking about dummy applications, I'm talking about an application that is truly, there's no basis for making the filing. I think that's.
Yeah, although as long as there's no misrep, 233 days, a lot can happen.
That's true.
And that's the longest so far.
It is the policy. And if they were processing more efficiently, then that would be the cure. But at this point, no, I hear what you're saying. This is why I don't do work permits.
Oh, it's well, and it's also the combination of the lack of flag polling. A lot of things are happening at once. They're firing half their department at IRCC, for those who don't know. They're going from 6,000 to 3,000 people. They ended flag polling, and it kind of all is just all these decisions are at the same time, or the effects are coming home to roost.
Well, there's also the issue with the BC Provincial Nominee programs, and this sort of goes to a question that's come in since we began the episode, which is about because of the change in the levels plan and the dramatic cut to provincial nominee programs, a lot of people who had a viable PNP application that suddenly, PNP programs paused. I mean, I think British Columbia was pretty quick to come back and say, this is what you can expect from British Columbia. But I don't know how it is in other provinces. So the question was about whether or not there will be an OINP draw. So that's the Ontario nominee program. But again, for people that are sort of, they're in the express entry pool, this goes to the first question as well. They have a 498, which used to be a very strong score. And they're like, well, do I file an open bridging? Because, maybe within that 233-day period, I will get an invitation and then I'll be eligible for that open bridging permit. These questions are both very good examples of people in those situations. I actually wouldn't hesitate to file a work permit application, I don't think. Fortunately, I don't have to make these calls because I don't do these types of applications. But yeah, it's really this is why this kind of question is so challenging. And I think just the idea that they're false applications and that they want to be able to just refuse them without remedying some of the other gaps in the system just feels.
Next complaint is pretty short. I'm not going to spend too much time for it, but it does highlight an issue. which is that, and again, these ATIP is of the dedicated service channel, and some of the complaints that they have received, which is in this case, some multinational company in Seattle wanted to develop a subsidiary in British Columbia and have basically said no. And one of the reasons was immigration issues that they were having and frustration with the process. And I just wanted to highlight it because, right now, um, the Liberals have committed as one of their election promises was to attract the best and the brightest to Canada. Canada has talked about using immigration in general to attract the best and the brightest, and our immigration system really can be a detriment and an obstacle to that. So
for sure. And I mean, when you are talking, we talked about a lot of this in the episode with your partner Ryan Rosenberg, just about what options there really are right now for those best and brightest. Because we've talked a little bit about Canadian experience class draws, but federal skilled worker draws just haven't existed at all. So somebody's outside of Canada, and we are seeing a lot of this from the United States. A lot of extremely skilled, qualified people wanting to find a pathway into Canada and being pretty shocked that even though they own doctorates, they own businesses, they have the ability to, to run businesses and to create job opportunities for Canadians, that they don't see a clear and obvious pathway.
So right now, our politicians are tweeting, including our immigration minister, that they're looking to attract the best and the brightest from the states. They are going to run head into their other promises of lower immigration levels and of that, a high Francophone target, unless they only want Francophone Americans to immigrate.
Which there are precious few. I have been...
A lot of Spanish-speaking ones.
Yeah.
So this one is another issue that is ongoing, and it is complaints from employers about outages where the IRCC portals are down. Like you, my work permit practice isn't as big, although I still do a fair number of corporate work permits. Luckily, I haven't been hit by this issue, but you do see panicked posts online and on the listserv of people who are unable to submit applications because the IRCC website is down. And that website being down, if people can't submit applications, they can be thrown, forget initial work permit applications, you can be thrown at a status. You can miss a draw in express entry, which could be your only draw if that's when the points have gone to 498 that one time.
Yeah.
It can be devastating.
Is this speaking to one particular platform, or it's just talking to just IRCC platforms in general?
This one is speaking on just IT outages.
Yeah.
So, and there's an example here. So as the IRCC notes, quote, currently applications are refused if submitted even a few hours past the deadline, leading to consequences such as loss of status, ability to work and study in Canada, and increased strain on the system through submission of the for more restoration of status applications. These outages affect applicants who miss invitations to apply, resulting in them the need to re-enter the express entry pool, end quote. So yeah, it's wild to think that that happens to people. The systems are all down, so they can't apply to extend their work permit. Now they got to apply to restore.
Yeah. I can go on at some length about technical issues with the portals. This is really a significant part of the reason why I stopped doing the economic immigration, because I found it so incredibly frustrating. I finally did manage to settle that litigation that I've talked about on the show before about the uploading of the fee and how, but the platform itself is so not user friendly, and just has so many issues with it that we like to call it the minimally viable product. And we've heard for so many years that that's going to improve, but the consequences of poor technology are really substantive. And I see that this is going to be more and more of an issue going forward, in litigation and whatnot, that, procedural fairness, what is the burden on the department to have a system that is actually fair, that doesn't compromise the rights of one versus the other based on technical issues like this. But again, it's always the issue of trying to prove where the technical deficiency was, and it's hard to do.
We have a question on the YouTube about when will a new immigration minister be appointed. I think Carney is announcing his new cabinet on Tuesday, so we will see then. The next one is similar issue, another tech issue. It's amazing how much our system is dependent on tech issues. This has to do with the employer portal, which is that, for those who don't know, in order to submit an LMIA exempt work permit, that for a closed work permit, a employee's prospective employer must first submit an online offer of employment. And one of the kind of odd things about the system that they set up is that the login information for employers, if they don't use the portal for 2 years, their login information will be revoked, which can cause a problem because a lot of work permits are valid for 3 years. So that by the time that an employee needs to renew their work permit, if the employer hasn't done any other work permits, their login information in their employer portal will have been revoked. As per this IRCC internal complaint, quote, with no telephone support for employers, it has been reported by employers that it can take 3 to 4 weeks of back and forth communication to resolve this issue, end quote. So it's just another issue that they'll have to deal with. I don't have too many additional comments. I wish, if I could make a recommendation to IRCC, like, if the norm for a lot of work permits is going to be 3 years, it makes sense to maybe reset these GC keys after 3 years instead of 2. But
I think just generally, the only comment I have is that generally the idea of having no functional technical support issue when there is a known problem with so many different functions of the portal that we're all taking to Twitter, and I don't know if that's still the case, but to try and figure out what's going on, why is the portal down, but that there's no individualized way of approaching somebody and saying that they're facing a technical problem when the system is so when it's so rights dependent,
Yep. This is one that I'm just going to pivot. But when I initially compiled these slides, early childhood educator shortage in British Columbia was still a big part of the Provincial Nominee program here. And it, however, since, and you actually wanted to discuss this topic, the BC Provincial Nominee program essentially has been closed so far this year. As we've discussed before on Borderlines, IRCC in November, as the 2025 to 2027 levels plan, cut without warning the provincial nomination quotas by 60%. British Columbia did not do a draw since, and last week or 2 weeks ago announced that due to the cuts, this year they were only going to be able to issue invitations essentially to people in healthcare, and that there would be 100 spots for non-healthcare workers to receive draws, that the pool was about 10,000 right now, and it wasn't clear how they would allocate amongst these 100 spots. Thoughts?
Well, I don't have a lot to add. I do note that they did make a draw on May 8th for skilled workers. They said on May 8th, they issued invitations to apply to 94 candidates who will create high economic impact. The minimum score was 150 points. Minimum wage was $105 per hour.
105 per year or per hour?
Per hour.
There we go.
Yeah. So yeah, it's like really, really, high earners, high income earners. But again, if it's 150 points, if I'm reading this properly, a minimum score of 150 points, it sort of seems like an or. So either minimum wage of 150 per hour, currently working full-time in BC for the supporting employer, and the job offer was not 0 or 1, or a minimum score of 150 points. So it was 47 per each of those two categories. So that's what they've done. So I don't know if that means that they've now used their entire quota for the year. If you're saying that the original announcement said that they were going to do 100 non-healthcare. So it's kind of anybody's guess. But at this point, the BC PNP is basically done.
Yeah, it's
unless you're a healthcare worker.
We will skip this one in the interest of time. It's just on more on delays. This one about the amount of time it takes employers in British Columbia to get a provincial license, which is a prerequisite to them applying for an LMIA. Employers obviously are not happy about delays there. So just general frustration from employers and confusion over whether it is possible for postgraduate work permit applicants to apply to restore their status. So I'm sure you're aware of this issue of like someone applies for their PGWPCA and it's rejected. I think the specific concern here is that by the time the rejection occurs, it took so long for a decision that they're no longer even eligible to restore. But it highlights a broader issue, which is like, is it even possible to restore to a postgraduate work permit? Mm-hmm. And this continues to be one of those weird aspects of Canadian immigration law where you'd like the answer to be straightforward and you'd think it should be straightforward. But the IRCC website says different things, judges say different things, and it really is pretty unpredictable.
Yeah, I don't remember if I ended up working on this case where they had, in a reply, they had said that the person should have restored to a bridging study permit. And I was like, what?
It becomes confusing because like, okay, you're supposed to restore to a study permit, but you no longer have a letter of acceptance.
Exactly.
But you need to restore to that and then apply for the work permit. But even that, several judges will say is not allowed. So
yeah, it's very, very confusing. It's and again, just the lack of a straightforward answer to that question.
Yeah, we've talked about this, that employers are expressing big time frustration with background verifications being completed, which has resulted in multiple mandamus applications. We talked about this a year ago. I think we might have talked about it 2 years ago. There is no let up in the number of mandamus applications. Is pretty much all I have to say on that background check delays continue and people continue having to go to court. I don't know if you were part of the recent bench and bar, but Chief Justice Crampton was saying that there was a 50% increase in the number of JRs filed this year over the same period as last year, which was like a 50% increase over the year before, and that a quarter don't have applicant records filed, which is probably all the mandamus applications by self-reps. So this continues to be an issue. I have no idea what the court's going to do about it because, as you've talked about, the courts are a bit of a backlogged mess.
Yeah, and I think that like during that period of time where I feel like there was a lot of information out there about your answer is always to file a mandamus application. It became popularly spoken of, put forward, and I don't think that that's incorrect, but I think that a lot of people thought that just by making a demand letter and filing the ALJR with no intention of following through, that was going to help. And frankly, it did help at the beginning. But, I think the question for the court is whether or not there's actually an intention to proceed. And so I think what they're really trying to actively discourage is people proceeding when there is no intention to follow through. You're just hoping that the filing of the mandamus writ in itself will push things along.
And actually, in the last week, there's been 2 federal court decisions. I can't remember the names, but one is from Madam Justice Ngo, NGO, and one is from Madam Justice Turley, in which the Department of Justice raised this issue of multiple mandamus applications, no applicant records being filed. And basically, we're trying to argue that the applicant wasn't coming to the court with clean hands, that the Department of Justice had like multiple respondent memos that they had to do. And both Madam Justice Turley and Madam Justice Ngo said that it's permissible to file multiple mandamus applications and that each application has to be decided on its own.
Mm-hmm.
So the other thing I would note about mandamus is the jurisprudence seems to keep going for the most part against IRCC.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't know where it's all leading to, because it
Yeah, I
also
don't know
doesn't seem
either.
to be leading to a more efficient background check system.
No, it sure doesn't.
And I have no reason to think that it will become more efficient.
Yeah.
And there continues to be complete silence from the politicians or the department as to what exactly it is they're looking for.
Yeah. I mean, if like, I think some of us had hoped that the influx of mandamus litigation would have an actual effect on policy and an actual effect on overall service standards. I don't think that that's come to pass. And I don't really think that there's any indication that it will, particularly given the information about layoffs. But
Yeah. And they continue to be a complete black hole. Like CSIS, half the time someone does an ATIP to CSIS will be like, oh, we can't even tell you if there's an investigation about you. And it's just like, what is the possible rationale for that? Like, what is it? Is national security going to be compromised if the person learns that CSIS has an investigation into them when IRCC has said and CBSA has said there's a partner agency? Like, it's such a black box of secrecy for really unclear reasons,
mm-hmm.
which Mosley got into a bit on the podcast. Justice Mosley, just how secretive everything is.
Mm-hmm.
This one is sort of old news. The increase to 20 hours to 24 hours for people working off campus. I'll skip ahead of it just in the interest of time. That whether or not to expand the Trusted Employer Program, GTS, to different sectors is also being discussed. And again, for those who don't know what we're reading, there's a unit at IRCC called the Dedicated Service Channel, which helps employers. And they also liaise with IRCC and employers if you're organizing an event. They can anyways be very helpful. I've contacted them for a few things, and they are a pretty helpful unit. And it was just neat to see this with all the different complaints and ideas that they're receiving, including this one, which I'm curious to know your thoughts, which was a First Nation band. I just thought this was interesting. And we still haven't done an episode on First Nations law at Borderlines, which
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to do one because it's not an area of expertise of mine at all. And I have a bazillion questions. But this
Mm-hmm.
one was this First Nations band would like under express entry that foreign nationals who work for or in an Indigenous nation should receive more comprehensive ranking score points, similar to the bonus points for being bilingual or studying in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just curious as to your thoughts about that.
I've spoken to a lot of clients in similar circumstances where they're living on reserve or they're living in very rural communities where skill shortages are acute. And, some of the times it's been about a caregiver that they want to employ, and, there's truly no alternative childcare opportunities, and just the frustration that there's no ability to do anything to expedite when it's so much adding to unemployment and underemployment of the employers themselves because of the remoteness and the skill shortage and all in these regions. And so, I think it really frustrates all of the issues around the ability to self-govern and who can you hire and all of this sort of thing. I think it really makes these old colonial issues come to the fore for sure.
Yep. And I think to wrap it, the last question that we got is, who would I recommend for the position of immigration minister? Jonathan Wilkinson. He's my MP. I could bike down outside his office, which is in Lower Lonsdale somewhere.
That's amazing.
And even if his door's locked, I could yell through the window different ideas about immigration that at least then I'll know are making their way to the minister. Beyond that sort of joke answer, I have no idea. I don't even know it was 169 Liberal MPs.
Yeah.
I kind of wonder, like, I don't know if immigration will. I assume they're going to stick with their current minister. She hasn't been at it that long.
I
But
agree
I
with
don't know
that.
if you have any thoughts on it or.
I don't really. I don't know the Liberal cabinet well enough, to be honest. And but I think that that was probably a pretty the decision to appoint our current minister was probably done in a collaborative way, I would expect, and I would be surprised if they didn't put her back in.
Yeah, I also don't know how much who the minister matters. The sense that I got is that while, say, Jason Kenney and Chris Alexander, like in the Conservatives, had a bit of leeway, that from what I understand, the Prime Minister's office may have driven a lot more. I don't actually know if any of the Liberal ministers, I think they all got reelected, so I don't know how free they are to speak. But if any of them do want to come on Borderlines, there's an open invitation to any of the ex-ministers to discuss their time on the to discuss their time in the ministry. Before the last election, when it looked like they would all lose their seats, I had thought that we might have a lot of guests because we could reach out to all the former MPs who lost their re-election, but I think they all got re-elected. So we already had John McCallum on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. I think that is all.
Yeah. Pleasure chatting.